Okay, let's look at it. 1 Samuel 15 verse 2 says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have." A little background here. The Amalekites were the perpetual enemies of God and Israel. They were about as bad as you can get. Just imagine the worst pagan heathen, bloodthirsty, murdering, just terrible, worst thing. Multiply it by 100, and that's the Amalekites. Matter of fact, it started all the way back in Exodus chapter 17 when God's people were coming into the promised land. The Amalekites ambushed them and attacked them when they were weak and they were vulnerable. And God said, "I'm never going to forget it." He said, "I'm never going to forget it." And so, but it wasn't a one-time event. If you read through Deuteronomy, Judges, Joshua, and 1 Samuel, you'll see that the Amalekites are always coming against God's people. And I'm telling you, they're the worst. These guys, one historian described them, they're the kind, they hated the God of Israel. And what they would do is they would literally rip children open, and they were so bloodthirsty, and they would take the flesh and fling it into the air and curse God. Okay, that's the kind of people we're talking about here. They were constantly provoking and pillaging Israel, and they were really violent, and God had promised to judge them, and here he has finally said it's enough. He says, "Salt, take them out." Look in verse number 3, the last part of verse 3. He says, "And do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Now what you need to understand, that's hard, isn't it? That's a tough lesson right there. You know, men, okay. Women, that's not good. Nursing infants, we got one back here. Right? I imagine all of us would line up to protect that nursing infant. But here God is saying, Saul, Israel, wipe them out. Every single one of them. Don't let any one remain. Look at this. This is what you need to understand. This was not a war of conquest and pillaging. This is a war that was all about justice. Justice. This is not a war where Saul is supposed to get rich as the conquering king. He's not supposed to take prisoners, not to touch any wealth. God is executing judgment on the Amalekites that he had promised them that he would give them. Now, I know you might get hung up on this a little bit and be like, why would God? You know, you would understand a self-defense war, right? Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, so we had to go hit them in the teeth. You can understand that, but if you weren't in this situation, you might be thinking, women? Children? And the short answer is this. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But there's two ways of looking at justice, and really still in the world today, but specifically then. Us as Westerners, we think of justice as an individual thing, right? You do the crime, you do the time, right? But Eastern people, they think of, in this part of the world, they think of justice as a more communal, community thing. Justice was for the community. When a person in the West is guilty of a crime, they stand on their own. But in the East, the mindset is that you never stand alone. That everything you do involves the community and the family and all of us together. The truth is, and so which one's right? Well, they both are. Right? The Eastern view is right, because we know that even though you think, you know, what I'm doing ain't hurting nobody, that's not true, is it? Right? We're never just lone individuals. What we do affects others in our community. Think about a child that's born with fetal alcohol syndrome. That's born with fetal alcohol syndrome. What did that child do to deserve fetal alcohol syndrome? Nothing. What the healthy baby that's born without fetal alcohol syndrome, what did that child do to deserve to be born healthy? Nothing. Both of those children are living with the consequences of their parents. You see what I'm saying? Both of those children are living by those. It works the other way. Your children, you raise your children in a godly home. They will be, now they may take advantage of that, but they will be blessed by how you bring them into the world. You know, if you're not shooting Jack Daniels while you're pregnant, your child may not have fetal alcohol syndrome. Right? For example, this is not in the slides. If you go down and look in this same passage, I think I put it in my notes. It's verse 6. Again, it's not on the slides or in your notes. But the Kenites had helped God's people. And so the Kenites are there with the Amalekites, and God says, tell the Kenites, separate yourself. Right? God is saying, don't hurt them, right? Because they had helped Israel when Israel was in need. Now here's the Amalekites. They're about to pay a steep price. And the Kenites are getting away scot-free because they had helped God's people. Both of these groups of people are facing the consequences of the actions of their parents. Right? The Amalekites' mamas and daddies, and the grandparents that had attacked Israel. The Kenites, the mamas and the daddies, and the grandparents that helped Israel. Both of them are living with the consequences of those actions. And so it's true in biblical, is a communal aspect to sin, but also it's an individual thing. You know in the Bible, when you stand before God, you're going to stand for your sin, not for somebody else's. Not for your mamas, your daddies, or your grandparents, right? We're judged individually. So both are true. Your sin does affect the community. Everybody pays a price. You think you don't, but it does. It affects everybody. But at the same time, you're going to stand alone in judgment in front of God for the consequences of your sin. And by the way, your sin that you're going to stand in front of God for, part of that is how it affected other people. Right? The ripple that you created with your sin, how you did things. So in a passage like this, when God delivers over someone to death because of the actions of another, you're just kind of seeing that communal aspect of judgment that we all know is real and that it exists. What you're not seeing is the other side of the picture. Those men, women, boys, and girls, and those nursing infants, they're coming before God individually. Does that make sense? They're coming before God individually. You just saw the communal aspect of judgment. God will judge nations. If you've ever read the Old Testament, you know it's true. And also, but God, while He judges nations in this life, He judges individuals in heaven. And so after death, these children, they're going to stand before God, and they're only going to answer for themselves and not for anybody else. This is a tough pill to swallow. It's actually it's terrible. It's a blessing for those infants and for those children to go to heaven rather than to be raised by those Amalekites, to become the worst kind of pagan, heathen sinners in the history of the world. We as Baptists, we believe in a thing called the age of accountability, right? So when that child goes to heaven, they're not accountable for their actions. They're not being judged for those things. And so it's actually a blessing. It's better for those children, for God to take those children to glory rather than to allow those children to continue to live and be barbarous. I mean, you just can't imagine, okay? They make Vikings look like Boy Scouts. They're being delivered from that evil. But that's tough. That's a tough pill for us to swallow. It doesn't mean that you and I get to do that, by the way. It doesn't mean that we get to justify, right? Like, well, we just need to send them on to heaven. No, not at all. God doesn't work. God in the old, He doesn't work the same way today that He did then necessarily. Then God used the nation of Israel as a tool of judgment against the nations. He used Israel. He says that in His Word, that He's going to use them to bring judgment on these pagan nations that rejected Him. Right? But He's not using you today to reap that same kind of judgment and make that same kind of decision. The main point, though, to remember when you read this, that God is making in these passages, number one, He had promised the Amalekites long before this, I'm going to judge you. I will not forget. And they never turned from their wicked ways, and God did judge them here on earth. And then as individuals, they stood before God in heaven. The other thing that you really need to see out of this, the idea is this is not about conquest. This is about judgment. It's not about Saul winning and getting rich and being a victorious king or anything. Saul's not to have anything for himself. It's not about Saul. This is about God and the Amalekites.